Hello, my name's Anstey Harris and I'm going to talk to you lockdown style on behalf of the good people at Gateshead Libraries about my latest novel, Where We Belong. Where We Belong is a novel about many things. It's about grief, it's about loss, it's about living with depression, but despite that, it's actually a very uplifting and happy story with some very uplifting and happy characters. So I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about the setting of this book and a little bit about my writing journey and how I came to be a published author, because that always seems something that people are very interested in, particularly people who are emergent writers themselves. I know that as part of my writing journey, I spent a lot of time listening to what authors had to say about how they'd got to where they are and what they found was important on that journey. And I think it's kind of a responsibility to look back and share a little bit of what you've learned with other people. So I hope you find that interesting. So Where We Belong is set in a fictional coastal town in a fictional county, but it bears a striking resemblance to a town not very far from where I live, excuse me, called Westgate-on-Sea. And very close to Westgate is another little village, kind of tiny town called Birchington. And in Birchington, there's a museum called the Powell Museum. The Powell Museum was put together about 120 years ago by Percy Powell, who was a Victorian anthropologist and conservationist. Amongst other things, he was an explorer. He was very interested in how the world works, and particularly in genetics, although he didn't know he was interested in genetics because obviously that hadn't been discovered as a subject then. What he was interested in is how different traits pass down from generation to generation, which is kind of interesting, and that became genetics. Percy put together a huge collection of animals from various expeditions in Africa and in Asia. They are taxidermied they're taxidermied animals, and they are arranged in dioramas, which is a huge display of animals appearing to be in the wild or in the situation that they came from. And although they are collected by area, they're not really next to the animals they might be next to in the wild, and without thousands of miles between them. Now, one of the interesting points about this, because this museum features a fictionalized version of this museum features in the book, which could be seen as controversial because obviously taxidermy and certainly hunting is very controversial, and I'm a committed vegetarian and very anti-hunting in any form. But we have to remember context, and the context is that Percy was a conservationist, and conservation in Victorian times meant something very different to what conservation means now. So conservation in Victorian times meant educating people, letting them even know that there was such a thing as a giraffe or a zebra or a wildebeest, because they didn't have televisions. A lot of people had no access to books, and they were certainly never ever going to get to see these creatures in the wild. And so Percy Powell brought these animals back. They were mounted rather than stuffed at a taxidermist in London, who were the most famous kind of taxidermy artists of the day. And then they were brought to Birchington, sometimes by rail, sometimes by kind of early steam lorries. And there was a huge kind of local fuss and all this. The parent of one of the volunteers at the real museum remembered being allowed a day off school as a child, or a morning or an afternoon off school, to watch an elephant arrive ready mounted before it was put into the museum. So yeah, that it's something that I felt the need to explain in the book, that the setting does contain a great deal of taxidermy. It contains a great deal of other artifacts as well, and obviously there's the same controversy surrounding those artifacts, in the sense that if we took back everything in the British Museum that was stolen, we would have a very empty museum. And I think that's the case for many museums that were put together during colonial times, when people simply didn't know any better. One of the things about the Powell Cotton Museum that does make it stand slightly apart from those other collections is that it does have a ledger of trade. So the items that particularly Percy Powell Cotton's daughters, Antoinette and Diana, Antonia and Diana, they traded for items that indigenous populations gave them. And they actually kept a ledger of all of the things that they exchanged for those items in real life, which is really interesting because it's what we now know as fair trade, and what we expect or hope would happen in most of the transactions, certainly, that eventually end up with us. So that's a little bit of background about the museum. I've always loved this museum. I first went there when I was 3 with my parents, and I was animal obsessed for my entire childhood. So I think it was the first place where I could really see animals that didn't hide, didn't have the advantage of a really nice a nice massive cage where they could just be away from the visitors. And nobody really likes those zoos where they don't have those massive cages. So I was very keen on this museum as a child. My children were, now my grandchildren are. But I took my goddaughter there when she was about 8, and I fully expected her to just jump into it the same as everybody else. But instead she was really upset and said, I hate it. I really hate that all these animals are dead. So we had a very long conversation about what we should do with the animals. They're already dead. They're already taxidermied. Should we keep them in a cupboard because we know better now than to kill all these animals? Or should we put them on display and be able to teach people what happens if we hunt things into extinction? And she agreed in the end that we should exhibit them. And I think that was one of the moments where I realised that I would write about this museum that I've loved all of my life. The characters who come to inhabit this museum are Kate and Leo. Kate is a woman at the end of her rope. She has nowhere left to turn. She has nowhere to live, and consequently her son Leo has nowhere to live. She's a teacher and she's been made redundant, and it's the end of the summer term and she has no job to go to in September. So the only place that she and Leo can conceivably go is to her husband's grandfather's museum out in the middle of the country, and her husband never visited and wouldn't allow them to visit, so she really has no idea what to expect. She certainly doesn't expect the old family retainer and the air of kind of hopelessness that falls over the museum. And the rest rolls from there, really. One of the things that I really wanted to do in this book is to have a hero who has a learning disability. And that's, without being too much of a spoiler, that's what we have. It's something that's been very, very important to me since I very first started writing. I feel that all too often when we have a character in fiction or even in film with a learning disability, that disability is their story. And for me, I've always wanted to represent some of the people that I've met in my life who for them, that very much isn't who they are. They are people first, and they may happen to have a learning disability. And I wanted to create a character that could help to share that with a wider audience. And I hope that I have. Certainly the reviews for Where We Belong have been terrific and really heartwarming, actually, because it also deals with some very difficult issues. It deals a lot with depression and a lot with loss and grief. And I've had some really, really heartwarming and terribly sad, but at the same time terribly joyful emails from readers who've identified with issues that are covered in this book and for whom it's meant a very great deal. And I think although Obviously, any book that's come out in lockdown really suffers from the fact that we haven't been able to get to any bookshops. I think also at the same time, perhaps a lot of people have really identified with Where We Belong because it's about loss. And during lockdown, we have all, even those of us fortunate enough not to have lost family or friends, we have all lost our way of life and what we assumed was our safety. So I think a lot of people have identified with it for that. So a bit about my writing journey. This is my second published novel. My first one, I've got a stack of books here beside me. My first one was The Truths and Triumphs of Grace Atherton, which was a Richard and Judy book, which for me is just the absolute pinnacle of achievement. I started writing about, well, I mean, I wrote all my life and then I kind of stopped, and my advice to anybody young in writing would be just do it. Just please do it. Don't have that 20, 30 year gap that I left in there. So I started writing about 2001. I joined an online forum called Write Words, and that was really, really helpful. Just being able to talk to lots of other people who were emergent writers. Eventually in 2008, I went and did a master's in creative writing, and I would really, really recommend any kind of formal training for writers, whether that be a master's or a U3A class or something in your local college, or now more and more online Zoom classes. It's so important to learn the science behind writing, to learn that it isn't just random words on a page, that there is as much science to it as there is to anything else. And that once you learn those rules, once you learn to control your prose, then you can start to break the rules and to look at things differently. And doing a master's made a world of difference to me. And I teach creative writing now, and I can see the difference in people after, a couple of courses where they've kind of started off quite, you can see their obvious talent, and you can see that they will succeed because they're so determined. But just learning a little bit about how we write and why we write and who we're writing for really, really makes a massive difference to people. So it took me a very long time to get published. And that's for a variety of reasons. One being that I wasn't ready and I wasn't good enough. So these are, although these two are the only two books of mine that you might know, there are another 6 or 7 on my computer, finished books that will never see the light of day. And I'm glad of that now, although at the time that seemed like the worst thing that could possibly happen to me. But with every single one of those books, I was honing my craft and I was improving. And I hope that as I go on to my third published novel, I'll be improving again and I'll be honing it further. One of the things that's really interesting about writing that I didn't know before I started was that books come out in different countries with different covers and sometimes even different titles, depending on the market. So that happened with The Truths and Triumphs of Grace Atherton. So this was its paperback cover. Before that, its original hardback cover was this one, which is so beautiful. This had a bit of water on it because I read in the bath, even my own books. And the other thing about this one is it's really beautiful. If there's a copy in Gateshead Library, that it looks even better without its clothes on, which can't be said for many of us. So The Truths and Triumphs of Grace Atherton came out in America as Goodbye Paris, which in this gorgeous livery, kind of Tiffany coloured, I'll leave that one for now. I really, really like this cover. And the reason for this is that in the UK, we like books with long titles, and we're quite likely to buy them, like Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, The Unusual Pilgrimage of Harold Fry. We like those kind of things in the UK. They tell us what we're going to get. We understand if we see a title like that it's a kind of book that we might have read before, we might have read in that genre, it might be a book club book, might be something we would enjoy. In America, at the time that this came out, short, snappy titles were the way forward. although they have now moved on and just looking at books with longer titles. Hence, Where We Belong is coming out in America as The Museum of Forgotten Memories, with this fabulous cover. This is the proof copy of it. But it's just fantastic. I just love a cover with a stuffed bear on it. What's not to like, really? And there's a penguin on the other side and the real copy. Goodbye Paris came out like this in paperback in America. So you could be very easily forgiven for accidentally buying the same book twice on Amazon. They're very, very different, but it's all about markets. In Australia, Where We Belong has come out. I don't have a copy, so I have to just show you in paper, but it's come out as The Museum of Forgotten Memories, which is the US title, but with this fabulous cover all of its own. That's in Australia and New Zealand. And then sometimes the covers are just completely different. So this is The Truths and Triumphs of Grace Atherton, but in German. So this is Find Me There Where Love Is, which has a very beautiful gatefold sleeve on the inside. Yeah, a beautiful cover, but very, very different to any of the others. So that was something I didn't know at all before I started. There's many things I didn't know about writing before I started. But the thing that I can definitely tell you, if you are an emergent writer, is that it's just about keeping on keeping on. It's just about keeping going. And with every setback, you have to learn something from it. Learn about why you were rejected, turned down. It's all very negative language. It's almost as if when you're writing, you're kind of, you have a load of obstacles to get over, but they're all new ways in which to fail. And you have to really gird your loins and just convince yourself that you will succeed in the end, that if you just keep trying, you will succeed. And I think my 14-year journey to publication really is evidence of that. The forum that I was on, Right Words, I literally watched every single other person in my group be published, and I was the very last one. But sometimes that is good for you. It means that by the time that you're published, you have honed your craft, and you are, I'm so glad that my first novel was never published. There's a saying in writing that your first novel is autobiographical and your second novel is fiction. I can really relate to that, and that's why I'm really glad that my first novel was never published. It was probably a bit personal for all concerned, not in a erotic way. So yeah, writing, tenacity, just hold on. Don't be afraid of writing genre fiction. There's a lot of people who kind of would think more of writing literary fiction than writing genre fiction, but for me, genre fiction is what I read, it's what I enjoy, it's always been what I want to write, and any kind of writing done well is art. It's an achievement, and you know yourself whether you've done it well or not, so you don't always need the accolade of being published. You can just use that as a really useful stepping stone to move on to your next book, and hopefully that will be the one that you break through with. If you do have any questions that you would like to ask me about my books, because it's really hard to just talk, and I've managed nearly 20 minutes, but it's tough on your own with no one asking you questions. If you do have any questions you would like to ask me, there is a contact form on my website, ansteyharris.com, and I would be delighted to read them. There's another thing I didn't know about books. It's incredibly lovely to receive emails from readers, and that's not something I ever knew happened. I had contacted published authors on Twitter to say that I'd really enjoyed their books, but I'd never looked someone out and emailed them. And so many people have done that to me, and I just think what an incredibly kind thing to do, to take up your own time to thank someone, in some cases on the other side of the planet, for writing a book that you enjoyed. It just seems really lovely, and it's really changed the way that I think about reading and what I read, and I certainly contact authors now when I've loved their books in a way that I didn't before. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. I presume you got this far. Thank you to Gateshead Library for asking me to talk to you, and please use your local libraries. A lot of people don't know that actually we get paid, authors get paid when you use your library. If you check a book out of the library, we still get a lending fee for that. So you're helping everybody, but most of all you're helping your community. Libraries are so valuable and we have to save them. Okay, thank you very much. I've been Anstey Harris.